By the middle of 1945, World War II was approaching its conclusion, but very few of the people inside the war understood that at the time. From a historical distance, the end appears inevitable and even orderly. From within the conflict, it did not feel that way. Soldiers, officers, and planners continued to act as if the war still had an extended future, because nothing in their daily experience clearly indicated that it was about to stop. Military institutions are designed to plan forward, not backward. They prepare for what might happen, not for what will soon end. In the final year of the war, this logic shaped decisions at every level. Units trained for future operations, staffs drafted plans extending into the following year, and logistical systems continued to expand rather than wind down. The machinery of war did not slow in anticipation of peace. It accelerated. This disconnect between historical outcome and lived experience is central to understanding the war's final phase. Victory, as later defined, was not visible in real time. Even as enemy capacity weakened, resistance continued, losses mounted, and uncertainty remained constant. The absence of clear collapse meant that the war's end could not be confidently predicted by those still inside it. Part of this uncertainty stemmed from the structure of modern war itself. Large-scale conflicts do not conclude smoothly. They fragment into separate fronts, timelines, and decisions that resolve unevenly. A breakthrough in one area did not guarantee resolution elsewhere. Each theater carried its own risks, constraints, and expectations, preventing any single moment from signaling a definitive conclusion. Psychology played an equally important role. After years of fighting, expectations were shaped by experience rather than optimism. Predictions of imminent victory had failed before. Soldiers and commanders learned to treat such claims cautiously. Preparation for a longer war became a form of self-protection against disappointment and complacency. As a result, the war's final months were marked by a paradox. Objectively, the outcome was increasingly clear. Subjectively, the end remained invisible. People continued to plan, fight, and endure as if the conflict still had no fixed horizon. The war did not feel like it was ending. It felt like it was continuing under slightly altered conditions. Understanding why no one knew the war was almost over requires examining how information, institutions, and experience shaped perception. It requires looking at the final phase not as a countdown to victory, but as a continuation of uncertainty in which preparation for the future remained unavoidable. This story is not about missed chances or dramatic reversals. It is about how wars end in practice, and why the moment of ending is rarely recognized until it is already past. For most people inside the war, the idea that it might be nearing its end was neither obvious nor persuasive. In the final year of World War II, behavior at every level continued to reflect an expectation of prolonged conflict. This was not a failure of judgment. It was a rational response to how modern wars actually function and how uncertainty is managed inside military systems. Armies are designed to plan forward, not to anticipate endings. Planning for continuation carries less risk than planning for conclusion. If a war ends earlier than expected, excess preparation can be stopped with limited consequence. If it continues longer than expected and preparation has been reduced, the cost can be severe. Faced with this imbalance, military institutions consistently chose to assume that fighting would continue. This logic shaped daily activity. Training schedules extended months ahead. Replacement systems remained fully active. Equipment was repaired, upgraded, and redistributed. Units prepared for future operations rather than demobilization. Nothing in these routines suggested an approaching end. From the inside, the war still demanded the same level of readiness it always had. Experience reinforced this caution. By the final phase, many soldiers and officers had lived through repeated predictions of imminent victory that proved wrong. Earlier expectations had been undercut by prolonged resistance and unexpected reversals. As a result, optimism lost credibility. Preparation for a longer war became a form of self-protection against disappointment and complacency. Daily conditions also mattered more than strategic assessments. Soldiers judged the war by what they encountered directly. As long as the enemy continued to resist effectively, the war felt ongoing. Danger, fatigue, and loss did not diminish in a way that suggested closure. Without a clear change in lived experience, there was no reason to believe the end was near. The global structure of the conflict added to this perception. Different theaters advanced at different speeds. Progress in one area did not guarantee resolution elsewhere. Even within a single front, advances coexisted with pauses, setbacks, and renewed fighting. There was no single moment that clearly signaled finality. Information flow reinforced uncertainty. Frontline personnel rarely had access to a complete strategic picture. Orders emphasized readiness rather than transition. Political leaders avoided firm timelines, knowing how damaging unmet expectations could be. The absence of definitive signals made caution the default posture. Over time, war became normalized, not comfortable, but familiar. Soldiers adapted to the idea that the conflict had no predictable horizon. Planning for future fighting felt safer than believing it might soon end. The routines of war continued because nothing had replaced them. From within this environment, the war did not appear to be narrowing toward a conclusion. It appeared to be continuing under changing conditions. The expectation of further fighting was not pessimism. It was the only assumption supported by experience. This is why the war's end was not widely anticipated by those inside it. The systems, routines, and daily realities of the conflict all pointed in the same direction. As long as those conditions remained, preparation for a longer war was the only rational choice. Continued resistance played a decisive role in shaping how the war was perceived during its final phase. Even as strategic conditions turned decisively against the Axis powers, fighting on the ground remained intense and costly. For soldiers and junior officers, the enemy did not appear to be collapsing. He was still present, still capable, and still dangerous. That reality outweighed abstract assessments of long-term outcome. In Europe, advances required sustained effort. Each movement forward demanded supply, coordination, and time. Defensive actions continued to impose casualties, and localized counterattacks demonstrated that weakened forces could still disrupt operations. From the perspective of those executing orders, the war did not feel like it was winding down. It felt like another demanding phase with its own risks and uncertainties. In the Pacific, this perception was even stronger. Previous campaigns had shown that loss of territory did not reduce resistance. Each island fought over had required extensive effort regardless of strategic context. There was no clear pattern suggesting that the enemy would stop fighting simply because the broader situation had deteriorated. Experience pointed in the opposite direction. As pressure increased, resistance often intensified. This continuity of danger mattered because perception is shaped by immediacy. Soldiers assessed the war based on what happened when they advanced, held positions, or waited. As long as engagement with the enemy produced loss and fatigue, the assumption that the war was almost over lacked credibility. There was no visible threshold beyond which resistance faded quickly. Commanders understood that enemy capacity was declining, but they also recognized adaptation. Defensive tactics evolved to maximize delay and cost. An opponent who changes methods rather than surrender does not signal imminent defeat. He signals persistence. This reinforced caution at higher levels and discouraged any relaxation of readiness. Casualties reinforced this mindset. Losses continued to mount in the war's final months. For those absorbing these losses, claims that the end was near felt disconnected from reality. Wars that are ending do not usually feel as lethal as wars that are ongoing. The persistence of risk suggested continuation rather than closure. Operational pauses further shaped perception. Advances were followed by periods of consolidation dictated by logistics, weather, and coordination. These pauses were not experienced as preparation for peace. They were experienced as preparation for the next phase of fighting. Equipment was repaired, replacements arrived, and training resumed. The cycle repeated. Modern wars rarely provide a clear signal of collapse at the tactical level. Resistance diminishes unevenly, creating pockets of intensity that obscure broader decline. Those inside the conflict experience these pockets directly. They do not experience the averages. This unevenness masked the trajectory of the war and sustained uncertainty. Earlier false expectations also mattered. Predictions of imminent victory had failed before. Veterans learned to distrust optimism unsupported by clear change. This skepticism became habitual. Readiness was emphasized, caution rewarded, and confidence restrained. From within this environment, the war did not appear to be ending. It appeared to be continuing under altered conditions. As long as resistance remained effective and routines unchanged, preparation for further fighting remained the only rational assumption. Uncertainty was reinforced by how information moved inside the war. Soldiers and junior officers did not experience the conflict through comprehensive strategic briefings. They experienced it through orders, routines, and immediate conditions. What mattered was not what might be happening at the highest levels, but what was required of them the next day. As long as those requirements involved readiness for combat, the war felt unfinished. Information was fragmented by design. Military systems limit what is shared downward to preserve security and flexibility. Frontline units were told what they needed to know to execute tasks, not how close the war might be to ending. Even when senior leaders believed victory was likely, that belief did not translate into guidance suggesting preparation could ease. On the contrary, uncertainty encouraged caution. This fragmentation shaped expectations. Soldiers rarely saw trends, they saw isolated events. A successful advance one week might be followed by heavy resistance the next. Without visibility into broader patterns, it was difficult to interpret progress as terminal rather than temporary. The war appeared episodic, not directional. Rumors filled the gaps left by limited information. Claims about imminent surrender or final offensives circulated frequently, especially during pauses. These rumors were rarely confirmed. When they proved false, they reinforced skepticism. Over time, soldiers learned to discount predictions of the end and focus instead on immediate survival and readiness. Command language also mattered. Orders emphasized vigilance, security, and preparation. Words associated with transition or closure were largely absent. Even when morale improved due to success, leadership avoided framing operations as final. This restraint was intentional. Premature confidence risked complacency, and complacency carried consequences. The structure of the war's final phase added to confusion. Different fronts progressed unevenly. One theater might show rapid movement, while another stalled. Success in one area did not resolve uncertainty elsewhere. For those serving in a single sector, distant developments did not necessarily translate into local relief. The war remained immediate and unresolved where they were. Experience reinforced this caution. Earlier phases had produced moments that seemed decisive but were not. Soldiers remembered these false endings. They remembered how quickly optimism could be replaced by renewed danger. That memory shaped how new information was received. Claims about nearing victory were met with restraint rather than belief. Time itself distorted perception. Long periods of waiting made it difficult to sense momentum. Progress, measured over months, was hard to perceive day by day. Without dramatic change, continuity dominated perception. The war felt ongoing because daily life remained unchanged. This environment discouraged emotional investment in the idea of an ending. Believing the war might soon conclude offered no practical benefit, and carried psychological risk. If the belief proved wrong, disappointment and distraction followed. Many chose instead to assume continuation and protect themselves from repeated letdown. From within this informational landscape, the war's conclusion was not invisible because people were uninformed. It was invisible because the systems governing communication, experience, and decision-making were designed to prioritize readiness over anticipation. Until the war actually stopped, nothing in daily life clearly indicated that it was about to. As a result, the end arrived not as the fulfillment of expectation, but as a disruption of routine. It became visible only after it had already occurred. Planning for the future reinforced the belief that the war still had distance to run. Even in its final phase, military staffs continued to design operations that extended well beyond the immediate horizon. These plans were not theoretical exercises. They involved detailed calculations of manpower, supply, and timing, all based on the assumption that large-scale fighting would continue. At the strategic level, this planning reflected institutional necessity. Armies cannot wait for certainty before preparing. They must assume worst-case scenarios and build capacity accordingly. In late 1944 and early 1945, uncertainty remained too high to justify scaling back. Enemy forces were weakened, but not neutralized. Political outcomes were not yet secured. Ending preparations prematurely would have created unacceptable risk. Operational planning filtered downward into daily life. Units trained for future offensives, rehearsed movements, and prepared equipment for conditions they had not yet encountered. Soldiers practiced for battles they might never fight. This effort did not feel provisional. It felt routine. Preparing for what came next reinforced the idea that something significant was still ahead. Logistics amplified this perception. Supply systems continued to expand rather than contract. Depots were built up, transportation networks reinforced, and stockpiles accumulated. These activities signaled continuation, not conclusion. Wars that are ending usually show signs of drawdown. What soldiers saw instead was sustained investment in the machinery of war. Replacement policies added to the sense of continuity. New personnel continued to arrive at the front. Units integrated them, trained them, and prepared them for combat. The presence of replacements contradicted any notion that the war was winding down. Armies do not feed fresh soldiers into a conflict they expect to end imminently. Psychologically, this mattered. Soldiers interpreted institutional behavior as evidence. If the system was still preparing, then preparation was necessary. Individual belief followed organizational action. Few questioned whether these efforts might soon be rendered unnecessary, because nothing suggested that outcome with confidence. This forward orientation shaped how losses were understood. Casualties were treated as part of an ongoing struggle rather than the final cost of a closing chapter. The absence of an expected endpoint made sacrifice feel continuous rather than transitional. The war still demanded payment, and that demand did not appear to be diminishing. Political messaging reinforced caution rather than optimism. Leaders emphasized perseverance and resolve. Clear timelines were avoided. This restraint was deliberate. Earlier in the war, optimism had often proven premature. Avoiding promises about the end protected credibility and maintained focus. It also sustained uncertainty. For those inside the system, these signals accumulated. Planning extended forward, supplies flowed, training continued. Losses mounted. Nothing in this pattern suggested that the war was nearing a natural stopping point. The machinery of conflict remained fully engaged. This explains why, when the end finally came, it felt abrupt. Not because it was strategically sudden, but because it interrupted routines that assumed continuation. The war stopped not at the end of a planned sequence, but in the middle of preparations for what was expected to come next. From within the process, there was no clear boundary between the present and the supposed final phase. The future remained open and demanding. Preparation filled that space. As long as planning extended forward, the war felt unfinished. Psychology played a decisive role in how the war's final phase was experienced. After years of fighting, expectations were shaped less by hope and more by habit. Soldiers and commanders alike learned to distrust the idea of a clear, predictable ending. Too many earlier moments had seemed decisive, only to be followed by renewed resistance and additional campaigns. By late 1944, optimism without proof felt irresponsible. This skepticism was not abstract. It was reinforced daily by routine. Soldiers continued to stand watch, dig positions, maintain equipment, and prepare for movement. These actions required effort and attention. As long as they were required, the war felt active. There was no emotional incentive to believe it was nearly over when daily life contradicted that belief. Believing the war might soon end also carried psychological risk. If soldiers allowed themselves to expect closure, and that expectation proved wrong, disappointment could be damaging. It could erode focus, discipline, and resilience. Many, therefore, chose a safer mental posture. They assumed continuation and treated any suggestion of an ending as speculative until confirmed by unmistakable change. This mindset affected how news was processed. Reports of enemy weakness or diplomatic movement were noted, but not fully absorbed. They existed alongside reports of ongoing fighting, casualties, and preparations for future operations. Contradictory information encouraged caution rather than confidence. Soldiers learned to weight what they saw directly more heavily than what they heard indirectly. Fatigue also shaped perception. Prolonged exhaustion narrows focus to immediate concerns. Long-term outcomes feel distant when daily energy is consumed by basic tasks. In this state, abstract ideas about the war's conclusion carried little emotional weight. What mattered was getting through the next day, the next watch, the next movement. Group dynamics reinforced this restraint. Expressions of confidence about the war's end were often met with quiet skepticism. Veterans corrected newcomers who spoke too freely about imminent victory. This informal regulation maintained a shared posture of realism. Hope was not forbidden, but it was kept in check. Leadership behavior contributed as well. Commanders avoided encouraging belief in a near end, not because they lacked confidence, but because belief without confirmation could undermine readiness. The safest message was continuity. Stay alert, stay prepared, assume the war is not finished. This guidance aligned with lived experience and was therefore accepted. Over time, this collective psychology became self-sustaining. The longer the war continued, the less credible predictions of its end became. Each passing month without resolution reinforced the assumption that more time remained. The war felt long because it had been long, and nothing suggested that pattern was about to change. This psychological environment explains why the end, when it came, felt disorienting. It did not arrive gradually in the minds of those fighting. It arrived as a sudden confirmation that overturned a deeply ingrained expectation of continuation. The war ended not because people believed it would, but because it finally did. From the inside, the absence of belief in an ending was not pessimism, it was adaptation. It allowed soldiers to function under uncertainty without being misled by hope. That adaptation sustained readiness, but it also made the end difficult to recognize until it was unmistakable. The war's conclusion was therefore not anticipated emotionally, even when it was becoming likely strategically. Psychology lagged behind reality, shaped by routine, fatigue, and experience. Until those conditions changed, the safest assumption remained that the war was still going on. The absence of a clear ending also influenced how losses were understood and accepted in the final phase of the war. Casualties did not decline in a way that suggested closure. Men continued to be wounded and killed during advances, defensive actions, and routine operations. From the perspective of those affected, These losses did not feel like the final cost of a concluding struggle. They felt like part of an ongoing obligation. This mattered because wars that are nearing their end often produce a change in tone. Sacrifice begins to be framed as final or decisive. In the last months of World War II, that shift was largely absent at the operational level. Losses were recorded, replacements assigned, and units rebuilt with the same procedures used earlier in the conflict. The machinery that absorbed a loss continued to function normally. Replacement systems reinforced this perception. New soldiers arrived at the front even as the war approached its conclusion. They were trained, equipped, and integrated into units as if they would be needed for extended service. For veterans, this was a powerful signal. Armies do not introduce fresh personnel into a conflict they believe is about to end. The presence of replacements suggested continuity, not closure. This process shaped how sacrifice was perceived. Losses were endured rather than questioned. The absence of an anticipated endpoint made it easier to accept continued cost as necessary. If the war was still going, then losses, however painful, were part of what had to be endured. The idea that lives were being lost in the final moments of a war that was almost over did not yet exist in real time. Operational language reflected this reality. Orders spoke of objectives, not endings. Briefings focused on tasks ahead, not on what might follow victory. Even when campaigns were described as important or decisive, they were not framed as final. This language mattered. It shaped how people interpreted risk and sacrifice. Fatigue reinforced acceptance. After years of war, many soldiers no longer evaluated losses against the promise of an end. They evaluated them against the immediate necessity of survival and mission completion. Emotional reserves were limited. Abstract questions about whether the war should still be fought carried little practical value when daily demands remained unchanged. The lack of visible transition also mattered. There were no widespread signs of demobilization, no systematic reduction of effort, no clear shift toward post-war planning at the front. The environment still looked and felt like war. As long as that environment persisted, the meaning of loss remained consistent with earlier phases. This continuity explains why the final casualties of the war were experienced without a sense of impending closure. Only afterward did they acquire the tragic weight associated with endings. At the time, they were absorbed into a pattern that had defined the conflict for years. The war's end, when it came, recontextualized these losses. What had felt like routine sacrifice became final sacrifice in retrospect. But that meaning was applied after the fact. It was not available to those still inside the war. From within the final phase, loss was still part of the present, not the conclusion. The absence of a recognized endpoint allowed the war to continue demanding payment until the moment it stopped. When the end finally came, it did not unfold as a gradual realization. It arrived as a disruption. For many inside the war, the transition from continuation to conclusion was abrupt, precisely because nothing in their daily experience had prepared them for it. The routines, assumptions, and expectations that had governed behavior for years were suddenly invalid. Orders changed faster than understanding. Units that had been preparing for further operations were told to stop. Training schedules were cancelled. Movement plans were suspended. Soldiers who had assumed months or years of continued fighting were confronted with a reality that required immediate psychological adjustment. The war had not slowly faded away. It had ceased. This suddenness explains why disbelief was common. Confirmation was sought repeatedly. Soldiers waited for clarification, expecting reversal or delay. The habit of skepticism, built through years of false predictions, did not disappear instantly. Even after official announcements, many remained cautious, unsure whether fighting would truly stop everywhere and permanently. The emotional response was complex. Relief existed, but it was restrained. Exhaustion limited celebration. For some, the end created uncertainty rather than clarity. The routines of war, however demanding, had provided structure. Their removal left a gap. Soldiers had prepared themselves for continued endurance, not for immediate transition. Losses from the final phase took on new meaning only afterward. Casualties that had been accepted as part of an ongoing struggle were reinterpreted once the war ended. What had felt routine suddenly appeared tragic in a different way. The knowledge that the war was over reframed sacrifices that had been endured without expectation of closure. For many, the realization of the war's end occurred gradually, not at the moment of announcement. It took time for daily life to change enough to confirm that the conflict was truly finished. The absence of orders, the easing of readiness, and the beginning of demobilization provided tangible proof that routine had shifted. Only then did the end become real. This delay highlights the central paradox of the war's conclusion. Strategically, it had been approaching. Experientially, it was invisible. The systems that sustained the war did not communicate endings. They communicated continuation until continuation was no longer required. In retrospect, it is tempting to ask why the end was not recognized sooner. The answer lies not in ignorance, but in adaptation. Soldiers and commanders had learned to survive by assuming the war would continue. That assumption had kept them alive and effective. Abandoning it prematurely would have been dangerous. The war ended not when people expected it to, but when the conditions that demanded endurance finally disappeared. Until that moment, preparation remained rational. Readiness remained necessary. The end, when it arrived, was not anticipated emotionally. It was confirmed practically. This is why so many remembered the war's conclusion as sudden, even though history shows it was long in coming. The end was not a feeling. It was a change in reality. Understanding this resolves the apparent contradiction. The war was almost over long before anyone knew it. And no one knew it because nothing inside the war allowed them to. Looking back, it is easy to assume that the end of the war should have been obvious before it happened. Maps show collapsing fronts, diminishing resources, and converging pressure. Timelines compress events into a clear sequence. From that distance, continuation can appear unnecessary or even irrational. From inside the war, it did not look that way at all. World War II did not end because people felt it was ending. It ended because the structures that sustained it finally stopped functioning. Until that point, those structures continued to demand effort, discipline, and sacrifice. Soldiers responded to what the war required in the present, not to what history would later reveal about its future. This distinction matters. Wars are not experienced as narratives with known conclusions. They are lived as ongoing conditions. Decisions are made under uncertainty, based on incomplete information and recent experience. In the final phase, recent experience still involved resistance, loss, and preparation. Nothing in that experience justified relaxing assumptions. The systems that made modern war possible were also the systems that concealed its end. Planning processes extended forward. Logistics flowed until ordered to stop. Replacement pipelines continued until they were formally closed. These mechanisms did not include a gradual signal for conclusion. They operated fully until they were turned off. Psychology followed structure. Soldiers adapted to endurance because endurance had been necessary for years. That adaptation did not reverse instantly. Expecting the war to continue was not pessimism. It was learned realism. It protected focus and readiness in an environment where mistakes remained costly until the last moment. Only after the war ended did its final months acquire a different meaning. Actions once taken as routine became the last actions. Losses once endured as ongoing became final losses. Preparations once considered necessary became unnecessary overnight. This transformation occurred retrospectively, not in real time. Understanding this reshapes how the end of the war is interpreted. It was not delayed by ignorance or stubbornness. It was obscured by the very systems that allowed the war to be fought effectively. Those systems were designed to prevent premature assumptions, and they succeeded. The war therefore ended as it had been lived, abruptly, unevenly, and without emotional preparation. For those inside it, the conclusion was not a long-anticipated moment, but a sudden change in reality that required adjustment after the fact. This perspective restores realism to the story of how wars end. Victory is not experienced as a countdown. It is experienced as a condition that becomes visible only once the demands of war disappear. Until then, continuation remains the safest assumption. World War II did not feel like it was almost over because nothing inside it allowed that feeling to exist. The end was not hidden by failure of insight, it was hidden by necessity. And that is why, when the war finally stopped, it felt less like the fulfillment of expectation and more like the interruption of something that had simply been assumed to go on.